Welcome to the channel, everyone. I'm so glad you're here with us today. Before we dive into today's exciting story, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always fun to see how far our stories travel. And if you're new to the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a new story. We've got something truly special lined up for tomorrow, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. So sit back, relax, and let's get started on today's adventure. This tourist learned the hard way, apologizing to a royal guard. Welcome to Buckingham Palace, one of the most iconic landmarks in London, a place steeped in history, grandeur, and timeless tradition. As the home of the British monarch, it stands tall and majestic, its golden gates gleaming under the bright sunlight. Crowds of tourists from all corners of the world gather here daily, eager to witness the royal splendor and immerse themselves in the rich culture that this palace represents. But while the palace itself is a marvel to behold, for many visitors, the true highlight of their visit is the royal guards. These guards, dressed in their unmistakable red uniforms and towering black bearskin hats, stand stoically in front of the palace gates. Their role is not just ceremonial. They are a symbol of the discipline, tradition, and unwavering duty that the British monarchy represents. It's said that they stand motionless for hours, regardless of the weather, the distractions around them, or even the actions of the tourists who flock to see them. The royal guards, in all their silent glory, captivate the crowds. Their ability to stand still, their faces impassive and unreadable, creates a kind of stillness that contrasts sharply with the bustling tourists who surround them. Some visitors find this quiet determination fascinating, even mesmerizing. Others, however, see it as a challenge. It's not uncommon for tourists to approach the guards, waving their hands in front of their faces, trying to make them laugh or react. Some pull silly faces, some mockingly imitate their stillness, while others attempt to push the limits, testing just how far they can go without provoking a response. Most tourists quickly realize that these guards are no ordinary humans. They are trained to remain calm and collected, no matter what antics unfold before them. But, as is often the case, there's always someone who pushes things a bit too far, someone who believes that the royal guard's stoic demeanor is just a game to be played. And on this particular day, it was a young man named Mark Davis, a 28-year-old tourist from New York, who found himself in the spotlight. Mark, ever the showman, was determined to see if he could break the guard's unshakable composure. He had a group of friends with him, all equally loud and carefree, and they were ready for some fun. As they walked past the guards, Mark's eyes lit up. "Look at them," he said with a smirk. "They're like robots. I bet I can get one of them to move." His friends laughed, warning him that these guards were trained for this, that they wouldn't be moved by any trickery. But Mark was unfazed. If anything, their warnings only fueled his determination. He scanned the area for something to use, and his eyes landed on a nearby trash bin, half filled with empty soda cans. Grinning, he grabbed one of the cans, holding it up for his friends to see. "Watch this," he said as he moved closer to one of the guards. The tourists around him began to notice, and a few even pulled out their phones, eager to capture what was about to unfold. Mark stopped directly in front of the guard. The guard stood tall and unflinching, his eyes fixed straight ahead, unwavering. Mark waved the soda can in front of the guard's face, but there was no reaction. The guard didn't even blink. So with a dramatic flourish, Mark tilted the can and allowed to drop, spilling the soda onto the guard's perfectly polished uniform. The crowd gasped, some in shock, others in anger. But Mark only laughed, turning to his friends with a triumphant grin. "See, nothing, they're like statues," he boasted, raising his arms in mock victory. His friends joined in the laughter, but the rest of the crowd wasn't amused. The guard, however, remained utterly motionless, his face as calm and unreadable as ever. What Mark didn't realize, as he basked in his small victory, was that the guard had made a subtle move of his own. A small press of a button on his uniform activated a silent alarm, notifying the palace security team of the disrespectful behavior. Unaware of the serious consequences his actions would bring, Mark continued with his day, oblivious to the fact that he had just crossed a line that should never be crossed. Mark continued his walk, proud of the stunt he had pulled off. He thought the whole thing was hilarious, and his friends agreed, laughing and high-fiving him as they moved further into the palace grounds. "I told you," Mark said, his voice filled with confidence. "They're like robots. No way they can react to anything." The tourists around him were still talking, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering about what had just happened. Mark didn't notice the disapproving glares from a few of them, nor did he see the woman with her 2 children, who frowned as he passed. She whispered something to her husband, who muttered under his breath, "That guy's going to regret it." Mark and his friends reached a nearby cafe, where they sat down to grab a quick bite. The table was filled with laughter, drinks, and jokes about the day's events. Mark leaned back in his chair, feeling like a star, basking in the attention from his friends and the pride of having done something most people would only dare to try. Bet that guard's still standing there, pretending like nothing happened. Mark chuckled, casually glancing over at his group. His friends laughed along, but one of them, Liam, looked uneasy. "I don't know, man," Liam said, glancing back toward the palace. "Maybe we went too far." Mark waved off the concern, with a casual shrug. "Relax. These guys are trained for this. It's their job to stand still no matter what. Besides, it's not like I hurt anyone." But Liam wasn't convinced. He could see a few other tourists casting strange glances their way, some shaking, their heads clearly not amused by Mark's antics. The laughter began to die down as Liam stared into his drink, his unease growing. Just then, the door to the cafe opened, and in walked 2 men dressed in sharp, dark uniforms. Their presence was immediate, commanding attention from everyone in the cafe. The room fell silent as the 2 security officers surveyed the crowd. When their eyes landed on Mark, a chill ran down his spine. One of the officers, tall and imposing, stepped forward. "Sir, we need you to come with us." Mark froze. His cocky smile faltered for the first time that day, his confident demeanor slipping away as the reality of the situation began to settle in. He tried to sound casual, but his voice wavered. Is there a problem?" The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the door with a slight motion of his head. "We'll explain everything outside." Mark's stomach churned as he stood, the laughter from earlier now completely gone. His friends exchanged nervous glances but didn't speak. Mark's heart pounded as he followed the officers out of the cafe, his steps hesitant, his mind racing. For the first time since he arrived in London, he wasn't sure if he was in control of the situation. The officers led him to a quiet area near the gates of Buckingham Palace, away from the bustling crowd. The air felt heavy, and the once confident Mark was now visibly uneasy. He tried to regain some of his composure, but it was slipping fast. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to sound tough, but his voice cracked slightly. The taller officer turned to face him, his expression stern but calm. "We witnessed your actions earlier today," he said in a firm tone. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" Mark blinked, still confused. "What? I didn't hurt anyone," he protested, his voice rising defensively. "It was just a joke." The second officer, shorter but just as imposing, stepped forward. "That joke, as you call it, was an act of disrespect toward one of the royal guards. These guards are not here for your amusement. They represent centuries of tradition, discipline, and service to the crown." Mark's mouth went dry. His confidence was quickly being replaced by the weight of realization. The officer continued, "When you dumped soda on that guard, you didn't just disrespect him. You disrespected everything he stands for, and that's not something we take lightly." Mark opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't. For the first time that day, he felt the consequences of his actions crashing down on him. The officers weren't finished yet. They were giving him a chance to make it right, but it was clear that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The officer's voice softened slightly, but his message was still firm. Instead of pressing formal charges, We are giving you an opportunity to learn from this." Mark's stomach turned. He didn't know what was coming next, but the uncertainty was unbearable. "Learn from this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The officer nodded. "Yes. You'll apologize publicly, not just to the guard, but to everyone who witnessed your disrespect." Mark's mind raced. He had expected to enjoy a carefree day at the palace, but now it was clear that he was facing a much deeper lesson than he ever anticipated. Mark felt a cold sweat trickle down his back as the two officers led him out of the cafe. His stomach churned and his mind raced, replaying the events over and over again. The laughter from his friends felt like a distant memory now, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. The palace security was taking this seriously, and he had no idea just how serious the consequences would be. The officers escorted him through a quiet part of the palace grounds, away from the tourists and the lively chatter of the crowd. Everything felt strangely still, as if the world had frozen around him. Mark's confidence had evaporated, replaced by a sinking feeling of guilt. He had no idea what was coming next, but he knew it wasn't going to be good. As they reached the palace gates, the taller officer stopped and turned to face Mark. His voice was calm but firm. "Sir, we are not here to threaten you, but to make sure you understand the severity of your actions. Disrespecting the guards is not something we take lightly. They are not just soldiers. They are symbols of centuries-old tradition, discipline, and loyalty to the crown." Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. I didn't mean any harm," he stammered, trying to explain himself. "It was just a joke. I didn't think it was a big deal." The second officer, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. His gaze was unwavering, his tone stern. "You didn't think it was a big deal, but that's the problem. You didn't think, and now you will have to face the consequences of your actions." Mark's knees felt weak as the reality of the situation sank in. This wasn't a harmless prank anymore. He had crossed a line and there was no going back. His friends who had been laughing earlier now stood in the background, silently watching the scene unfold. They too were starting to realize the gravity of the situation. The officers exchanged a brief glance before the taller one spoke again. "You will be escorted back to the palace gates. There, in front of the crowd, you will publicly apologize. For your behavior, you will apologize not just to the guard you disrespected, but to every single person who witnessed your actions today." Mark's heart raced. "What? Apologize? Publicly?" The thought of standing in front of a crowd, admitting he was wrong, was almost unbearable. "But I didn't hurt anyone." The officer's expression remained calm, but there was a trace of disappointment in his eyes. "The problem isn't about physical harm. It's about respect. Your actions were a violation of the respect that is owed to these guards, to their duty, and to the traditions they represent." For the first time, Mark felt the full weight of his actions. He had been so focused on getting a laugh, on being the center of attention, that he hadn't considered the deeper meaning behind what he was doing. Now, standing in front of these two officers, he understood just how wrong he had been. The taller officer's voice softened slightly. "This is not about embarrassing you. It's about teaching you and others a valuable lesson in respect. We hope you will take this opportunity to learn." Mark didn't know what to say. He felt exposed, vulnerable. His mind was racing, and a part of him wanted to back out, to run away from this uncomfortable situation. But he knew that wasn't an option. He had made a mistake, and now it was time to own up to it. As the officers led him back to the gates, Mark could feel the eyes of the crowd on him. Tourists, once enjoying the splendor of Buckingham Palace, were now whispering among themselves, their phones pointed at him, recording the unfolding drama. His friends walked behind him in silence, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and embarrassment. When they reached the gates, the officers gestured to a small raised platform near the entrance. Mark felt his stomach drop. This was it. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped onto the platform, trying to steady his shaking hands. The crowd had gathered around, their eyes on him, waiting for him to speak. It felt like the entire world was watching. The officer's voice was firm. "Apologize for your actions, Mr. Walker, and show respect to the guard and everyone here who witnessed this." Mark took a deep breath, his throat tight. For a moment, he froze, unsure of what to say. But then, looking out at the sea of faces, he knew he had to be honest. He had to own up to what he had done. I just want to say I'm sorry," he began, his voice shaky at first. "Earlier today, I disrespected one of the royal guards. I thought it was just a joke, but now I realize it was wrong. These guards stand for something much bigger than just standing still. They represent tradition, respect, and service to this country." Mark paused, trying to steady his breathing. The crowd was silent, watching him closely. "I didn't understand that before, but I do now. I set a bad example, and I regret it. I want to apologize to the guard I disrespected, and to everyone here who saw what I did. I was wrong." For a long moment, the crowd remained still. Mark felt exposed, vulnerable, but in that moment, he knew he was doing the right thing. Finally, the crowd's silence was broken by a few soft claps, and then more people joined in. The applause wasn't thunderous, but it was enough to let Mark know that his apology had been received. The officer stepped forward, giving Mark a nod of approval. "Thank you, Mr. Walker. We accept your apology." As Mark stepped down from the platform, he felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't over yet, but he had taken the first step in making things right. As Mark stepped down from the platform, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The crowd, still murmuring about the public apology, was slowly dispersing, but the weight of the moment stayed with him. His heart was still pounding in his chest, his palms clammy from the uncomfortable spotlight. He glanced over at his friends, who stood at a distance, visibly uncomfortable but offering no support. Mark couldn't blame them. After all, he had dragged them into this mess. The tall officer, who had been the most firm with him, approached. Mark braced himself for what was next, unsure of what to expect. He thought it was over, but it was clear that there was more to come. "Mr. Walker," the officer began, his tone serious, "you've apologized to the crowd and to the guard, but there's one more step." Mark's stomach sank. One more step? He had thought he'd done everything, but now it felt like the consequences were still unfolding, layer by layer. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice shaky. "I've already apologized. What more is there?" The officer's eyes met his, unblinking. "You need to apologize to the guard personally. You disrespected him directly, and now you need to face him, in person, on his terms." Mark froze. The idea of facing the guard, the one he had mocked so publicly, sent a shiver down his spine. He had been so focused on his own joke, so blinded by the need for attention, that he hadn't thought about the human being behind the uniform. Now, the thought of making a personal apology felt like an insurmountable task. The officer turned and gestured for Mark to follow. Mark's heart raced as he followed the officer through the gates, where the guard he had mocked earlier stood, still in full uniform. His posture was as straight as ever, his face as unreadable as it had been when Mark had dropped the soda can onto his chest. The guard hadn't moved, hadn't shown any emotion. But now, Mark was about to face him, and it felt like everything was on the line. When they reached the guard, Mark's legs felt weak. He swallowed hard, struggling to keep his composure. The officer stepped aside, giving Mark room to approach. For a moment, Mark just stood there, unsure of what to say. The silence between them was deafening. The guard, Sergeant Daniel Harris, stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed forward. There was no sign of anger, no hint of reaction. His stillness made Mark feel even more uncomfortable. It was as if the guard was waiting for something, waiting for him to take the first step, to show that he had truly learned something from this experience. Finally, Mark spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said, his words feeling small in the vast silence. "I was wrong. I didn't realize what I was doing. I thought it was just a joke, but now I know it was more than that." The guard didn't respond at first, but Mark could see his jaw tighten slightly. as if processing what Mark had said. Mark took a deep breath and continued. You stand there every day, doing your job, representing something much bigger than yourself. And I disrespected that. I disrespected you. I didn't think about how much dedication it takes to do what you do. And I should have. Mark's throat felt tight as he spoke. But for the first time in the entire ordeal, he felt like he was saying the right things. His voice grew steadier as he went on. I'm sorry for what I did. I shouldn't have treated you like that. I hope you can forgive me. There was a long pause, and for a moment, Mark thought that the guard might not say anything at all. But then, to Mark's surprise, Sergeant Harris gave the smallest of nods. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was the acknowledgement Mark needed to feel like his apology had been received. The officer who had been standing nearby spoke up. Thank you, Mr. Walker. That is enough. You've shown that you understand the gravity of the situation, Mark. Nodded, his heart still racing, but he felt a weight lift from his chest. He had faced the man he had disrespected, apologized, and for the first time since this whole thing started, he felt like he had taken responsibility for his actions He turned to walk away. Mark caught one final glimpse of the guard standing tall, unmoving. He realized that this man, this symbol of discipline and duty, had taught him something far more important than any joke could ever offer. As Mark walked back toward his friends, his steps felt lighter, though the embarrassment of the earlier moment still lingered. But now, it wasn't the mockery or the attention-seeking behavior that dominated his thoughts. It was the lesson he had learned about respect, about duty, and about the consequences of his actions. He had thought he was untouchable, but now he knew better. The journey wasn't over, but Mark was determined to carry this lesson with him. And though it had taken a humiliating experience to learn, he knew he'd never forget it. After Mark's apology to the guard, the tension in the air seemed to lift, but it was far from over. The moment felt strangely quiet, almost surreal. Mark's steps were heavier as he walked away from the guard, but there was a sense of relief building in his chest. He had faced the consequences of his actions, apologized sincerely, and now he thought it was time to move on. But deep down, he knew this experience had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully understand. The officers who had been overseeing the situation exchanged looks, their expressions unreadable. Mark couldn't help but feel their eyes on him as he walked back toward his group of friends. They were waiting by the gates, their faces a mixture of relief and discomfort, unsure how to act. None of them had expected things to escalate so quickly, but now that it had, they seemed hesitant to even speak. Mark's stomach still churned as he approached them. His once confident smile had faded, replaced by a quiet sense of humility. He wasn't the same guy who had walked into Buckingham Palace that morning, full of bravado and arrogance. No, now he felt different. Humbled, uncertain, and strangely enough grateful for the lesson he had learned. As he joined his friends, Liam, the one who had warned him earlier, was the first to speak. Man, I didn't know it was gonna go like that, Liam said, his voice low. But you did the right thing, apologizing like that. Mark nodded, but the words felt inadequate. I had to, he said quietly, his voice heavy with meaning. I didn't realize how wrong I was until it was too late. His friends nodded in agreement, though they too seemed unsure of how to process everything that had happened. For a moment, the group stood in silence, the weight of the situation lingering in the air. Mark's mind was still racing, trying to make sense of the events. But something about the experience felt like it had planted a seed of change inside him. As the group began walking away from the gates, Mark noticed something that had eluded him earlier, the reactions from the other tourists. Some had been disapproving, some had been amused, but now, as they passed by the palace's grand gates, many of them shot him curious looks, some nodding approvingly. Mark realized that the crowd had seen everything unfold, the mockery, the public apology, and in the end, the sincerity of his words. It was a moment that wouldn't be forgotten, not by him, and not by anyone who had witnessed it. The sound of footsteps behind him pulled Mark out of his thoughts. The two security officers who had escorted him earlier were walking toward him, their steps steady and measured. Mark's heart skipped a beat. What now? He had already apologized and he thought everything had been settled, but it was clear. They weren't finished. The taller officer who had spoken with such authority earlier approached Mark with a look of quiet approval. "Mr. Walker," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I trust you understand now the seriousness of what occurred today." Mark nodded, swallowing hard. "I do," he replied, his voice steady. "And I won't forget it." The officer gave him a small nod of approval, but his eyes remained serious. "Good. Understand that it's not about embarrassment. It's about learning. Not just for you, but for everyone who witnessed what happened." Mark thought back to the tourists who had gathered around, the whispers that had rippled through the crowd. His actions had made an impact, but the question was whether he would carry the lesson forward. "Thank you," Mark said, his voice a little quieter now. "I won't make this mistake again." The officer gave him a small, knowing smile. "That's the point. Every action has consequences, Mr. Walker. You've learned that the hard way, but it's a lesson you won't forget." With that, the officers turned and began walking back toward the palace. Mark stood there for a moment, watching them go, the finality of the situation sinking in. His friends, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. "Dude," Liam said, his voice filled with a mix of admiration and disbelief. "You really handled that. Not many people would have done that after something like that." Mark gave a small, wry smile. "I didn't have much of a choice. But yeah, I guess I learned something today." As they walked toward the exit, Mark felt a strange sense of closure. He had made a mistake, faced the consequences, and apologized publicly. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. And in the process, he had learned something far more important than any prank could ever teach him. The experience wasn't over, not by a long shot. The crowd, the officers, and the guard he had disrespected would stay with him. And the lesson about respect, discipline, and tradition was something that would echo in his mind for a long time to come. Mark couldn't help but feel that, in the end, this was the most valuable lesson he would ever learn. Thank you so much for watching today's story. I hope you found Mark's journey as eye-opening and impactful as I did. It's not every day that we get to witness a lesson in respect and humility in such a public way, and it's one that I'm sure we can all learn from. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this situation. Have you ever done something in the heat of the moment, only to realize later that it crossed a line? How did you handle it? Or maybe you've experienced something similar to Mark, where the consequences taught you something important about respect or responsibility. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely enjoy reading all of your responses and learning from your experiences. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on our next video. There's always something new and exciting coming your way, and you won't want to miss the next chapter. Remember, every action has consequences, and sometimes it takes something big to help us learn a valuable lesson. Can't wait to hear from you all. See you in the next video.